The field you see before you is situated 20 kilometers from Brussels, the capital of Belgium. 2 centuries ago, this very field bore witness to a pivotal confrontation in history, the Battle of Waterloo. The name Waterloo became synonymous with this battle due to its location. Engaged in this conflict was the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who fought his final battle to retain his throne. Opposing him was the British military leader Arthur Wellesley, more commonly recognized by his noble title, the Duke of Wellington. Both commanders were esteemed strategists of their era, commanding formidable military forces. However, Napoleon Bonaparte committed a grave error in underestimating his adversary. He derisively referred to the Duke of Wellington as a soldier's general, insinuating that Wellington was merely a soldier who had been erroneously elevated to a position of leadership by Britain. Napoleon scornfully reprimanded one of his generals, who had previously been defeated by the British, stating, "If Wellington has bested you before, it does not imply he is a skilled general capable of defeating any other French commander. Trust me, Wellington is an indolent general, and the English soldiers are clueless in combat." He arrogantly likened the impending Battle of Waterloo to a trivial breakfast engagement, suggesting that triumphing in this conflict would be as effortless for him as a morning meal. Was this battle as simple as breakfast for Napoleon? Why is the clash between the soldier general and the emperor general deemed one of the most significant battles in modern history? What unfolded was a disheartening spectacle. Persistent overnight rain had transformed the battlefield into a morass. This environment severely hampered the effectiveness of French artillery. Typically, French cannonballs were designed to ricochet upon impact, continuing their lethal trajectory into enemy ranks even at a distance. However, the sodden terrain drastically mitigated this advantage. Adding to Napoleon's challenges was his own dire state of health. The house at Waterloo served as Napoleon's final headquarters. On the eve of battle, it is reported that he suffered incessant vomiting and managed less than 4 hours of sleep. In better health, he might have been under hospital care, yet fate condemned him to the fields of Waterloo under less than propitious circumstances. The Battle of Waterloo was a complex engagement for Napoleon Bonaparte, facing not one, but 2 armies. Directly to the north in front of him stood the British army, led by the Duke of Wellington, bolstered by Dutch forces totaling 68,000 troops. To the east, approximately 15 to 20 kilometers away, lay the Prussian army, which could also be termed the German army, given that it hailed from the region where Germany would later be established. Commanded by General von Blücher, this force numbered 50,000. It's noteworthy that just 2 days prior, on June 16th, Napoleon had succeeded in driving the Prussians into retreat. Napoleon dispatched one of his generals, Grouchy, along with 34,000 troops in pursuit of the retreating Prussian army. His directive to Grouchy was explicit: harry the Prussians to such an extent that they would be unable to join forces with the British. However, this delegation of duty proved disastrous as Napoleon's commanders demonstrated a lack of competence. Disoriented, they failed to ascertain the Prussian army's whereabouts. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, the Prussians had encamped in proximity to Waterloo and could reinforce the Duke of Wellington's forces imminently. At this juncture, Napoleon's force was marginally over 100,000 soldiers, facing 2 armies. Furthermore, the battlefield conditions were far from advantageous. The rain-soaked terrain impeded his artillery's maneuverability. Yet a more significant challenge was the Duke of Wellington's masterful strategic planning. The selection of Waterloo as the battleground was a decision not made by Napoleon, but by Wellington, cognizant that many in his British army were green and their artillery not on par with the French. Wellington was aware that launching an offensive against Napoleon would likely end in defeat. Thus, he opted for a location where he could establish his forces defensively. The Waterloo Plain was advantageous due to a notable slope. Wellington ingeniously hid the majority of his forces behind this slope, rendering them invisible to the French. This obscurity was a considerable disadvantage for Napoleon, as the inability to observe the enemy's maneuvers can be a critical impediment on the battlefield. Wellington's troops, positioned on the forward slope, kept vigil over the French forces, enabling them to relay movements back to their commander. Moreover, Wellington's foresight led him to secure village houses and farmsteads to the right and center, behind which his army was concealed. Approximately 400 German soldiers, integrated into the British army, were stationed at a pivotal central position. Their capture was crucial, as it would bar the French army from launching a full-scale assault across the slope. Thus, the British army was entrenched in a formidable defensive position, with the Prussian army poised to provide reinforcement within hours. Given the muddy conditions that hindered movement and Napoleon's own illness, from the French perspective, the situation was far from ideal to commence hostilities. Yet why did Napoleon resolve to engage in battle? It circles back to the notion he harbored at the outset, that Wellington was not a formidable commander and the British army was far from professional. He trivialized the battle, equating it to a mere breakfast task. Despite recognizing the British army's robust defensive posture, he dismissed the enemy's capabilities, interpreting their defensive stance as an indication of fear and vulnerability, surmising that victory would be effortless. Napoleon was convinced that he would overcome the British before the Prussian army could intervene. Thereafter, confronting the Prussians in isolation would not pose a significant challenge. Despite the unfavorable conditions, Napoleon was compelled to proceed with the battle. Napoleon, impelled by necessity and strategic urgency, chose to engage in battle on that very day upon the same field. His health, precarious as it was, did not permit prolonged presence on the battlefield. Hence, he intermittently withdrew, either to recuperate or to survey potential avenues through which the Prussian army might arrive. In Napoleon's absence, Marshal Michel Ney, the senior commander, assumed control of the French forces. Thus, my inquisitive audience, such were the circumstances as the verdant plains of Waterloo braced for an imminent transformation into a theater of carnage. A contingent of British troops positioned atop the slope endured substantial casualties. Yet the bulk of the army, concealed on the reverse slope, remained largely unscathed. These troops lay prone, a tactic that allowed enemy fire to pass harmlessly overhead. After a time upon Napoleon's command, the French artillery ceased fire. Infantrymen were then dispatched to seize control of a farmhouse to the field's left, while another detachment was directed to assault a central farmhouse held by German soldiers. The French forces launched alternating attacks on the two sites, encountering stiff resistance at both. The farmhouse on the left, Hougoumont, witnessed intense skirmishes. French soldiers momentarily penetrated the courtyard, but were ultimately repelled by the resolute British defense. Despite repeated assaults and bombardments, the French could not secure Hougoumont. Similarly, at the central farmstead, La Haye-Sainte, the initial French onslaught was fiercely rebuffed by German defenders. A subsequent attack proved more costly, with heavy losses on both sides. Eventually, after a savage confrontation, French troops managed to breach the farm. Only 42 of the 400 Germans survived, retreating to join their compatriots behind the slope. Thus, the French standard was raised over La Haye-Sainte. While the struggle for the farms unfolded, direct engagement between the central British and French forces ensued. The right flank of Napoleon's army advanced toward the British positioned at the summit of the slope. As they approached, British artillery inflicted severe losses upon them. Nevertheless, the French soldiers advanced in dense columns. In contrast, the British were arrayed in an extended line along the crest of the slope. This formation allowed all British soldiers to simultaneously aim and discharge their firearms at the advancing enemy. The French, with their columnar formation, could not replicate such volume of fire. The soldiers in rear ranks were unable to engage unless those before them fell or gave way. Therefore, the British line conferred a significant advantage in firing capacity. As the French drew near, the British volleys commenced. Concurrently, cannonades from behind the British line rained down upon the French. During this exchange, a musket ball struck British Major General Sir Thomas Picton. He succumbed to the injury, a severe blow to the British command. The narrative of Waterloo, as vivid and chaotic as it is, reminds us of the razor edge on which historical outcomes can balance. The interplay of leadership, strategy, chance, and the indomitable spirit of soldiers marking the pivot of destiny. The relentless resolve of the British soldiers, despite their losses, underpinned their resistance against Napoleon's forces. Even as their ranks thinned, they were replenished by reinforcements that continued to fire upon the French, ultimately tipping the scales and causing the French to retreat. Wellington, seizing the moment, unleashed his cavalry, particularly the Scots Greys, hailing from Scotland, who charged with such ferocity that they overran the French artillery and captured a French eagle, a symbol of Napoleon's imperial guard. Elizabeth Thompson's painting, Scotland Forever, immortalizes this charge, encapsulating the valiant but overextended foray of the Scots Greys. Their advance, though initially successful, led them into isolation, and they were decimated by a fierce counterattack by Napoleon's cavalry. The Scottish cavalry's bravery was consequential but not decisive, as the French still had ample artillery to resume their offensive. Napoleon's attention, however, was soon diverted by the impending threat of the Prussian army, which he observed approaching from the east. With Napoleon withdrawn momentarily to gauge this new threat, Marshal Ney continued the assault, dispatching a massive cavalry charge against the British center. The British troops, under Wellington's command, swiftly formed infantry squares, a formation renowned for its effectiveness against cavalry, famously used by Napoleon in his Egyptian campaigns. These squares, bristling with bayonets, repelled the French cavalry despite repeated charges. While the mud impeded the lethality of French cannon fire, their bombardment still inflicted significant casualties upon the British. Ney's strategy, involving repeated cavalry charges and artillery bombardment, strained the British defenses. Even though the squares held, the constant pressure exerted by the French cavalry undeniably sapped the strength of the British army, setting the stage for the later phases of the Battle of Waterloo, which would continue to unfold with epic ferocity and historical consequence. Numerous British soldiers were either slain or injured. Bereft of the resolve to withstand further assaults, they were on the cusp of retreat. Had the French forces mounted a decisive offensive at that juncture, the British would have inevitably withdrawn. Alas, the French General Michel failed to engage the adversary promptly. In the absence of Napoleon's expeditious decision-making, the British forces seized the opportunity to regroup. Emperor Napoleon, having previously engaged with the Prussian forces and stationed 20,000 troops to obstruct their advance, resumed command from General Michel. His strategy was unequivocal: to repel the British with haste and then to direct full might against the Prussians. Thus, he deployed his elite Old Guard, a unit with an unblemished record of victory, confident in their capability to overpower the British. As the Old Guard advanced, the Duke of Wellington, perceiving the gravity of Napoleon's gamble, covertly positioned 1,400 of his troops atop a slope, effectively camouflaged from the enemy. This ambush proved catastrophic for the Old Guard. As they ascended, the concealed British troops stood and unleashed a devastating volley, decimating the ranks of Napoleon's elite. In the midst of the chaos, the British commander orchestrated his countermove. He commanded his entire force to charge down the slope, overwhelming the Old Guard with sheer numbers. Concurrently, the vanguard of the Prussian army engaged the 20,000 French soldiers stationed by Napoleon, swiftly gaining the upper hand despite their numerical inferiority. This pincer movement, British forces descending upon them and Prussians assailing from the rear, precipitated a collapse in French morale. Faced with annihilation, the French forces capitulated to panic. Napoleon, preserving his pattern of abandoning his troops in dire straits, fled, but not before instructing his artillery to delay the adversaries, enabling his and his high-ranking officers' escape. Despite the surrender, the French artillery persisted in their bombardment, inadvertently claiming the lives of their retreating compatriots. A remnant of French infantry resisted alongside the artillery, but ultimately, they too were vanquished. In this pivotal Battle of Waterloo, the Allied forces, the British and Prussian armies, suffered approximately 26,000 casualties, while the French incurred losses surpassing 40,000, with 7,000 taken prisoner and the remainder killed, wounded, or unaccounted for. In the aftermath, while the Allied forces commemorated their triumph, a disarrayed French force of over 30,000, together with a fleeing Napoleon, hastened towards Paris. Napoleon's retreat was so precipitous that he scarcely halted en route. Meanwhile, the British and Prussian forces, acutely aware of the situation, were not idle. Maintaining pace with her pursuers, she too arrived in Paris. There, the British army engaged in several clashes with the French until the city succumbed to British control. Napoleon, in the meantime, fled Paris for the coastal town of Rochefort, harboring aspirations of seeking political asylum in America. However, the Royal Navy thwarted his plans, effectively sealing his fate. Acknowledging his defeat, Napoleon surrendered and was detained by the British, who transported him to Britain. Upon his arrival, a multitude assembled to glimpse the captive emperor. Napoleon harbored the notion that he might live out his days in Britain as an ordinary citizen. Nevertheless, the Allied powers had a drastically different agenda in mind. My inquisitive audience, recall how Napoleon made his audacious escape from the island of Elba to France during his initial exile. The British government, intent on preventing a recurrence, resolved to exile him to a locale from which return was improbable. St. Helena, an island in the Atlantic Ocean, positioned equidistantly between Africa and South America, was chosen as his final place of banishment. This remote island was where Napoleon spent his concluding years in relative seclusion, grappling with ill health, and where he resided in Longwood House. It was here that he penned his memoirs. Since falling ill post-Waterloo, Napoleon was afforded medical care by the British on St. Helena. Nonetheless, his condition deteriorated, possibly exacerbated by the despondency of his defeat and the collapse of his empire, leaving him enfeebled and susceptible to his ailment. Napoleon Bonaparte passed away on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. A post-mortem examination disclosed stomach cancer as the cause of death. The narrative of Napoleon's demise persists as a topic of speculation and intrigue. Controversy surrounds the possibility of poisoning by the British, with arsenic posited as the alleged agent administered through his food and drink. Modern medical professionals and historians, however, largely concur that gastric cancer was the culprit, independent of any foul play. This perspective is buttressed by the fact that Napoleon's father and a sister succumbed to the same malady, suggesting a hereditary predisposition. Following his death, Napoleon was interred on St. Helena. Yet in 1840, nearly 2 decades later, his remains were exhumed at the behest of the French government. Napoleon's casket was escorted to the shore in a solemn procession. Soldiers lined the route, rendering honors as the coffin passed by. The casket was then conveyed to France aboard a vessel, where it was received by French officials. In Paris, Napoleon was given a ceremonial cremation with full state honors, and his remains were enshrined in a newly crafted mausoleum of white and green marble. Back on St. Helena, the original resting place of Napoleon has been encircled by a forest to safeguard it, complete with railings, and the house where he spent his final days is maintained, proudly displaying the French flag in its courtyard. However, the island remains under British jurisdiction, an overseas territory signifying that Napoleon met his end in exile, remote from his homeland. Meanwhile, the victor over Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington, ascended to a revered status in Britain, even serving as prime minister on 2 occasions in 1828 and 1834. It poses a thought-provoking question. Between Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, who stands as the preeminent military commander, and which one found themselves on the just side of history? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Should you find yourself in Belgium, the Waterloo battlefield is an essential visit. Or perhaps we could bring its story to you. The site has been meticulously preserved, including the farmhouses that were pivotal during the battle. An artificial mound has been erected here, crowned with a lion statue to commemorate the battle, hence its name, the Lion's Mound. The building that served as Napoleon's headquarters prior to the Battle of Waterloo has been transformed into a museum. Furthermore, in the heart of London lies Waterloo Railway Station, a name that has transcended its geographical significance to become synonymous with defeat in the English lexicon. Such was the impact of this battle that it has left an imprint on the English language. This concludes the 4th mini-season of Generals and Battles, featuring the story of Napoleon for my curious fellows. Stay tuned for more historical narratives in this series. And if you haven't yet explored this remarkable season detailing the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, I encourage you to visit this playlist. Discover why the United States and China are racing to return to the moon and delve into the complete sagas of the great general Khalid bin Walid's campaigns against Rome and Persia.